So thanks for coming out. Small group, but that's not bad. What I want to talk to you about today is it's work, in a sense, in theological anthropology. Though as you will see, I will push the envelope for a little bit. So bear with me, and then at the end, I hope we'll have a fun discussion about some of the ideas that I will talk to you about. As the title here gives it away, God's self-communication in an evolving world. There's a little bit of Kalanana there that will come to the fore. A little bit of thinking in terms of continental contexts. Let me start with an observation. An observation that primatologists have made in the field. When great apes encounter water in different ways, it could be rain, but another example that is very well described by Jane Goodall, an encounter of waterfall in the Gombe National Park, where she has worked for 60 years under her, almost 55 years under her chimpanzees there. At the side of the waterfall, the chimps will act very strangely. Hair will stand up. They will start to rhythmically move. They will vocalize. They will start swinging into, lines swinging into the waterfall. They will throw stuff into the waterfall. And then that goes on for quite a while. It doesn't make any sense at all. And then after a while, they'll just sit in a fig tree or by the side of the river and be quiet and just stare at the water. That takes for a little while, and then they just pick up and leave very quietly. And so biologists always see things and ask themselves, what's the biological function? Because that's how we're primed to think, right? If you see something, a phenomenon in biology, you think there must be a function to it. If there's not, why the heck is it there? How did it come about? And there is no function here that biologically makes any sense. So are we just looking at very crazy apes, or what is it that we're dealing with? And Goodall asks a very, I think, intriguing question. She asks, is it not possible that the chimpanzees are responding to some feeling like awe? Was it perhaps similar feelings of awe that gave rise to the first animistic religions, the worship of the elements and the mysteries of nature, over which there was no control? Only when our prehistoric ancestors developed language would it have been possible to discuss such internal feelings and create a shared religion. And that's for the biologists, the thing where most biologists would say, awe and apes, okay, let's see what that is all about. And of course, for the theologian, I hope that's the case for you, many of you, then that word awe, of course, your ears prick up. Because awe is indeed an aspect, a fundamental aspect of, let me call it that, religious experience. Right? So think about what Joshua Heschel said, for example. Heschel says about nature, there are three aspects of nature which command man's attention: power, loveliness, and grandeur. Okay? He says, power he exploits, loveliness he enjoys, but grandeur fills him with awe. There's the awe. What smites us with unquenchable amazement, he also speaks of radical amazement later, is not that which we grasp and are able to convey, but that which lies within our reach, but beyond our grasp. Not the quantitative aspect of nature, but something qualitative. Not what is beyond our range of time and space, but the true meaning, source, and end of being. In other words, the ineffable. So here, awe, we can see, has something to do with that fundamental experience of nature, which, for at least Heschel, moves quickly into the religious realm. Well, another example would be Rudolf Otto. He writes about awe, and you know Otto's work, obviously. He speaks of awe as well. He says, the feeling of this awe that we have when we experience the numinous may at times come sweeping like a gentle tide, pervading the mind with a tranquil mood of deepest worship, can pass over into a continuously flowing mood of the soul that is long-lasting and reverberates until it finally fades and releases the soul into the profane. It may burst forth from the soul with spasms and convulsions, or lead to a strange excitement, to intoxication, entrancement, and ecstasy. the early 20th century was so much more flowery in their expression, but it's beautiful after all. It has wild and demonic form. Its wild and demonic forms can sing to an almost ghastly horror and shuddering. It has its wild and barbaric antecedents and manifestations and can develop into the beautiful, purged, and glorious. It may become the silent, humble, trembling, and speechlessness of the creature in the presence of, yes, of what? Of that which is ineffable mystery is above all creatures. The awe as a experiential category, if you like, the religious experience, here too very central. Right? There is the experience of the ineffable, mediated through here as well, potentially an experience of nature. It does not have to be anything grand like the Grand Canyon. It could be something small. Well, if awe is indeed such an essential part of experiencing the ineffable, the question could be that then, well, Gödel was not only right that this may be an antecedent of something that prefigures the experience. Could it actually be the non-human animals, not all, but some non-human animals are actually aware of the ineffable and experience it with awe? That's a question that I would just like you to play with. Okay? Go ahead. I just started. You still see the question. If you read fast, you won't miss much. Have a seat. Right, so the question really for me here that I would like to explore is, could it be that some non-human animals have an experience of the ineffable? And what I will argue is exactly that. Humanity is not alone in encountering the ineffable. This experience of the numinous, if you like, to speak again in terms of auto, is not solely a human thing. Some non-human animals are indeed capable of experiencing the transcendent. And I would like to call this proto-religiosity. I would say this is a form of proto-religiosity. And, that's the important thing for me, a species-specific personal relationship with God. Now, that's hopefully provocative and will keep you awake for at least next 5 minutes. And then we'll just play with that and see where it goes. So we all know that theological anthropology works, of course, with the book of Genesis, and there is this very important statement here that humans are created in the image of God. And this has been, for all intents and purposes, one of the key passages to define the human being over and against other life. Of course, as Karl once pointed out, the interpretations that we find of what the image of God really is, this B'Tselem Elohim, is syncretic at best. People have given the meaning to this term, have interpreted it more in the sense of their worldviews in which they worked than based on what was there in the text, because there's little in the text. I think it was very insightful from Bob, and then of course the next thing that he does is he does exactly the same thing when he gives his interpretation of the Imago Dei. But I think it's a good point. What is the Imago Dei? And how far, the B'Tselem Elohim, and how far would that really put us over and against animals? Is that a good starting place for a theology of animals and also for theological anthropology? Well, I think a very common way of distinguishing different interpretations is a tripart typology of interpretations. And I find that very helpful, so I thought I'd show you that here. You can have a substantive interpretation where the image of the B'Tselem is really identified with some trait or property of the human being, usually reason. Now that identification of reason goes back to Philo of Alexandria, was then taken over in many ways by the early Christians, and it was really where Aristotle came to the fore. Right? So that is something that we often find in interpretations. Somehow this image has to do with a particular trait. There's a functional way of interpreting the image of God, where our actions reflect the image in us. We're image bearers and that we act a certain way. Now, one way to think about that is dominion over the earth, and of course dominion is a term that we get from Genesis 1, not 2. In Genesis 2, we only have the human being is put into the garden and tended. So that is often interpreted in the sense of stewardship, as far as I'm aware, the earliest that I could find was Hugh of St. Victor, who in the 12th century talked about the image that we bear in comparison or analogy to divine providence, just how God providentially takes care of us, we are to take care of nature or of the brute animals. It's another way of thinking about who and what we are when we say that we are image bearers. And then finally, there's the relational interpretation, where divine image can be found in our relationships that we keep with each other, but also with God. And that, of course, is one approach that Putz really developed. And as I said, his interpretation, I think, is just as syncretic as the others. Now, all of these are nested categories if you think about it. It's very hard to imagine that someone could have fun, have the image of God as having dominion over the earth, being a steward of God on earth, without having reason and some type of cognitive and affective capacities that allow to act and function in this way. And the same holds for relational interpretation. So I would say that actually all of these, though they help to lay out the landscape, can be not reduced but brought back to the substance of interpretation. What does that mean then for animals? Well, that's pretty clear. For animals, that means that they're not it. Of all the beings there are, somehow animals are not quite as we are. We are kind of separated from them. And how are we separated from them? We are uniquely related to God in and through the image of God. So there is, it seems, an ontological difference between them and us. Right? And if you think about Roman Catholic thought, and John Paul II wrote about this, you could say, yes, there's evolution, and that's all good. Evolution more than just an hypothesis, it's a fact. But when it comes to the human being, we have an ontological leap. He speaks of an ontological leap. So what does that mean? What's the image of God? So if that's your starting place, then basically, well, it seems like we're at an end. Right? You could say that's it. I could sit down and we could all have a beer and let's talk about something else. Well, there are those, of course, who think, no, that's not quite it. Let's see whether we can work with that image category a little differently. And there are those who use a cosmic Christ or deep incarnation approach. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but basically the idea here is, and it's, as you see in a variety of big names in the field, basically the idea is that Christ is, of course, as well, God being transcendent. Christ is, the Son is transformative for the entire universe, including other beings than us. So, yes, they died like we do, but they too shall be saved through Christ's transformative action in the world. Right? Now, San Clemente, some might know of you, the Basilica in San Clemente has this beautiful cross that kind of gives you, it's a little hard to see because it's quite powerful enough, but you see here Christ on the cross, and you see the wounds, there's a spring coming forth, and all of that feeds the tree of life from which all animals spring forth. So you can see that Christ works, it's not a very new idea really. Christ works transformative, of course, for the entire cosmos. So from that perspective, it might seem as if the idea that we have our salvation to take care of and the rest is just the backdrop to our salvation is too simple a picture. Right? And that's fair enough. Nevertheless, it's still anthropocentric. Why? Because you have an incarnation of a human being, and that incarnation is obviously important for the transformation of everything. And it is not just that, think about it, if Christ transforms, well, that's good, but if the incarnation is important to transform us, then not the least because we have a conversation with Christ, or had, right? And becoming man makes it available to us what we're called to. That doesn't help bees or other animals. So the transformative power of Christ could be achieved even without an incarnation. So the question is, what's the point of the incarnation? So from that perspective, the incarnation in a human being seems important, I get that, but it's still very anthropocentric. So I personally find that the image of God, even in that interpretation, doesn't help me any further. Now, others, and myself too, have tried to extend the category. Here the argument was basically that turning towards the natural sciences, and especially the data that we have on the various animals, what we can see is actually that to say we are the only ones self-conscious around here, those who have self-consciousness, who have the capacity to have relationships and so forth, that doesn't fly anymore. In light of the new data, what we have to do is actually we have to extend the category if we say that's part of what it means to be in the image. So, as you see, it's very substantive interpretation oriented. Right? And from that perspective, then, yeah, you could spread that category. And as I said, I've tried, Gregory Peterson has done it, David Cunningham, various people who've tried that. Celia B. Drummond has done it to some degree. Tried to open up the category to be inclusive for animals. There's one hiccup here. You cannot, again, a syncretic reading of the text. The text does not really give you that. That's not to be found in the text, so you have to stretch the category based on really its interpretation throughout tradition. And so some have, I think, reasonably argued, well, you can't do that. Fair enough. What's an alternative? Well, our own Joshua Ward's here has suggested a special form of biblical election. Now, his argument is really interesting. So I'm going to try to unpack that. I think it's a very brilliant and interesting argument. First thing he says is that Josh takes the biology extraordinarily seriously. He's very aware of how the biological data comes together. He says, species, the idea of biological species cannot longer be seen in an essential way. The idea that species have essences, that doesn't fly, that flies in the face of biological data and understanding today. So he says we should let go of an essentialist view of species, that we should think about species in a different way. Now, he's well within the realm of philosophy of science and philosophy of biology. Biologists, does anyone know by any chance how many species concepts biologists work with? They work with about 26 different species concepts. And you would think that, what is the theoretical foundation for the biological sciences? It's evolution, the origin of species, the development of species, right? The specification is it. And yet we don't really know what species is. And on another day you can ask me what a gene is, and then we'll say, well, it's Tuesday, and we'll go with that definition today. So some of those big categories that we use in biology all the time, we really don't. All right, now, he says, no, we should think about a species as a statistical category. Okay? Perhaps as a category that comes out of a particular lineage. Right? So I call a species which have, members of the species are characterized by a certain percentage shared of characteristics coming out of a particular lineage, an evolutionary lineage. At that point, the species category is no longer ontological, it's an epistemological category. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. That might very well be the case. How does that help us in the question of animals and in the question of the image of God? Well, Josh says this. God does not create us in the image of God thereby giving us something like a substance of, like an aspect of our substance that makes us in the image of God. We're chosen. We're elected. Human beings are chosen. This gift of the image is extended to human beings only. And that doesn't mean that animals are, when it comes to cognitive capacities, incapable of doing certain things that we can. Josh would be the first one to say that great apes have self-consciousness and all of that. They're not in the image because they were chosen. Right? Well, that actually chimes very well with the text. Not only that, it also chimes very well with early Jewish and even early Christian interpretations of the image. So it seems like we're on the go. What Josh seems to have achieved is he has saved the category of the image, And yet he adopts evolutionary thinking, and he can bring in animals in the relationship to animals in a good way. The role that we have as being image bearers is not to just use everybody how we want. We're, in a way, co-creators of our future, so we play a role here on this earth, stewards of God. So, okay, very nice. Here's my problem with this. And it's a very simple problem. If there is no species, how are we chosen? If there is no species, no ontological species, how are we chosen? Right? The idea was that humans were chosen, but there is no such thing as a human being. All we have is statistical differences. So at what percentage point did God say, you? So it's brilliant, I think this is, and Josh and I have talked about this millions of times, and I think, I don't know, I'm just going to say what I think. I hope he feels the same way. I have the greatest respect for his thought. We are struggling with the same ideas, and we approach the very similarly from slightly different ends. I think it's a brilliant proposal, but I haven't gotten over this hump. I don't know how best to do that, but he's working hard at it, and I think it's brilliant work. For me, the problem that I'm left with is still that the image as a category is not very helpful for either a human, for theological anthropology, or for theology of animals. So what I'm suggesting here is actually something else. Let's just get rid of the category. That's not to get rid of the category, but ignore it for the question that I'm interested in. What I want to ask about is more to refocus our attention to the personal relationship as divine self-communication. And those familiar with Rana hear the Ranierian language here pop up. And I want to unpack that. This, I will say, you can think about without making reference to the image category. So not only going to tell you that chimpanzees are in a personal relationship with God, I also tell you don't think about the image. So please don't throw any shoes. You can just tell me you don't like it. That was a joke. It's all good. Okay. So there are two pillars of this argument that I want to bring forth. One is the theology of experience. And I will carefully unpack that, make sure that we don't misrepresent the term here. The other one is David von Cognitive mythology. Okay, so let me start with the theology of experience. And let me go straight to Kavanagh's theological project. Why Kavanaugh? Because he offers, I think, a very interesting into a theological anthropology, which then can help us also to think about animals. So what is his entryway into anthropology? He asks a very simple question. I don't know how that happened, but okay, just read the first part. What are the necessary conditions of the possibility of receiving God's revelation? That's a simple question about the human being. What about the human being? It's a simple question. I'm not saying it's a simple answer to be found, but it's a simple question. What about the human being makes it possible for the human being to be a recipient of God's self-communication or of God's revelation? In other words, to use Rana's God's own language, what does it take for us to be a hearer of the word? And he says that the human being is a potentio potentialis for gratuitous and salvific divine self-communication. Now, the Thomists among the crowd here will immediately pick up on this. This is, of course, the idea that it takes from Thomas that somehow we're created in such a way that we have an opening towards God, a desire for God. Thomas also speaks of the desiderio naturalis. And what does that mean? Well, we have a desire for the beatific vision. Okay, well, why do we have that? Where does that come from? First thing here is this is a creative appropriation of the scotus. What Anana is doing is basically saying, yeah, we can think about God in a theistic sense, we can think about God in other medieval ways. I want to say that scotus is a very adequate way to think about it from a Catholic perspective. That's the one that I would like to choose here. I would go with scotus. Why does he do that? Well, for scotus, God creates the world in order to communicate God's self. And creation exists why? In order to receive God's self-communication. He doesn't speak of self-communication, I use that word, nobody can get it, right? We're there to receive the unopened, free, loving divine self. And you know that this, for Scotus, actually meant, in opposition to Anselm, atonement doesn't make any sense. Why? Because Christ came first. Right? Christ is always first. If atonement were to work as Anselm proposes it, what does that imply? Well, our suffering, our sinning actually forced God's hand. God had to incarnate. Why? Because we sinned. For him, that doesn't make any sense. What Scotus would say is God would have incarnated even if we had not sinned. Being saved from sin, it's a freebie, people. You know, God does that, of course. God is God. But it's not the meaning of the incarnation. So it's a slight shift of attention, but a significant one. Why is it significant? Because now the idea is really that God wants to communicate with himself. That this relationship is of a co-lover, as Scotus says, with God. That is really in the fore. That's in the foreground. Of course, Scotus didn't know anything about evolutionary biology. We have to think about how that works. I'll say a few words about that later. But Lana takes that perspective pretty seriously. Right? God was incarnated even if humanity had not fallen. For Scotus, creation, that's where it gets interesting. Creation is always ordered toward creatures that can receive God for his love and glory and respond to it in terms. Again, did he know anything about evolution? No. What was the creature that could do this? Human being. But now think about using that doctrine of God in a conversation with evolutionary biology, and you might see where Ghana was going with that and where I'm trying to take that. Okay. Humanity's warranted co-lover. So, how would we have to adjust? I would like to propose how we have to adjust the modern, the scholastic theology of doctrine of God in order to bring that in conversation with evolutionary biology. Well, first, we have to embrace evolutionary worldview so that conscious beings emerge, and I don't mean emerge here in the technical sense in the field of theology and science. I'm not talking about the emergence of higher level properties that are not prefigured in the lower properties. I'm just meaning something comes out of the process of evolution, okay, just to be clear here. But modern scholastic theology, I would say, has to embrace evolutionary worldview where conscious beings emerge from the free processes of cosmic evolution. Cosmic evolution, I would say, that is transcendentally conditioned by divine action. I'll unpack that in a second. A lot to unpack here, as you see. Now, of course, the evolutionary biologists in the room will immediately tell me that cosmic evolution is not the same as evolutionary biology, and I agree with that. Biology evolves differently than, there's no natural selection acting on stars or planets. But without the development of stars or planets, we wouldn't have life and we wouldn't have biological evolution. So I would like to see that as a larger process. As an evolutionary biologist, of course, I would look at things differently than somebody who studies the emergence of stars or the birth of stars or life cycle of stars. Okay. But also argue we'd have to think of cosmic evolution in such a way that it cannot be seen as directed toward the human being as pinnacle, but a being also capable of knowing and loving God. And that's key for me. Stephen Jay Gould once said, if you were to rewind the tape of evolutionary history and play it again, what would happen? You would not get an intelligent being. I'm not sure about that. Where I'm going with Dakor is we probably would not get another human being that looks like us. Okay, that's in many ways accidental. But could it be that evolution, nevertheless, is directed towards self-consciousness? I think that's a totally different question. I think that could be argued, both metaphysically as well, certainly theologically, and I think there's good evidence in science to at least suggest that that is not an impossible idea to hold. And finally, a God who releases creation into evolution, thus accepting the possibility of numerous co-lovers, must want multiplicity of spiritual beings. What do we mean by that? Well, if the world really evolves, we said we have to embrace evolution here, right? And if cosmic evolution might not be moving towards the human being as we know, but towards self-consciousness, to self-conscious beings, to beings that are selves, right? And if that process is a free process insofar as that evolution unfolds freely, that doesn't mean independently of God, okay? It's not a zero-sum game. But if that's the case, then the diversification of life should lead to the diversification of spiritual life, and God should, if that were the case, desire it, because otherwise God would have set up the whole thing differently. Okay? I also would argue that you have to hold that a God who loves must be mutable. That's, of course, where I break very much with Scotus. For Scotus, that was not an option. But then he was a scholastic, but not great. But I think the loving relationship, and there are many who say that, agape does not require our eros. Fine. I turn towards Heschel here, this idea of the divine pathos and in relationship with human beings and with beings that can respond. I think a God who loves must be mutable in the sense that our loving relationship with God, our actions towards God, somehow move God. Now, how that works, it's a different story. To what degree God then changes, that can be discussed. I don't think that the very distant, removed, transcendent God who creates out of love, not because he cares about the whole lover, but just because God is perfect love and cannot do anything but to create out of love, that doesn't fly anymore. Okay. How does that all help us persevere with God's project? Now, Adam sees the human subject, the human being, which is spirit in the world, as a being that asks the question about its own meaning. We are to ourselves, he says, the science five. We're to ourselves the question of the meaning of our being. Okay, now that sounds good. Yeah, why not? Where does that come from? Well, here we have to make a little excourse to Martin Heidegger. Why? For Heidegger, the Seinsfrage, the question of the meaning of being, is a necessity. That's fundamental. His whole philosophy is a philosophy of being rather than an existentialist philosophy. And what he suggests is actually that as a particular being, as a particular entity, human beings are capable of knowing, noticing, and recognizing the ontological difference of beings. By ontological difference, what he means is, if you look at the Greek, on things that are entities, right? And being logos, the ground, as he interprets, is the ground in which things are grounded. So ontology deals with what? It deals with being as the ground of entities, that which grounds entities. Think about it this way: I and this chair and you, we are. Now we can be quantified, we can be organized, we can be typed, but the being in which we're grounded, that makes it possible for us to be typed or categorized and so forth, cannot be categorized. That's something that grounds us. This is our origin, if you like. This is our whence, certainly. Right? But as a particular form of entity, the human being is capable of recognizing that difference. It can reach, as it were, beyond the objects of its sense experiences onto this underlying ground of being in which itself is grounded. So the human being, he says, is Dasein. And you all know how difficult that is to translate, but let me just at least describe what he means by Dasein. Dasein is really a being which is concerned with its own being. It's the being that asks about the meaning of its being. But it doesn't do so necessarily by sitting down and asking itself, what is the meaning of my life? Rather, you do it as, in his words, being an entity which stands open for the openness of being in which it stands by enduring it. Okay? Meaning what? I mean, trust me, it doesn't read any better in German. It's still confusing. But it's actually, when you unpack it, quite beautiful. If you wonder about, I will give you an example in a second, but as I like to tell my students, when you got out of bed this morning, you dealt with the question of the meaning of your being. You didn't deal with it by thinking about it, but you dealt with it by getting out of bed in the morning, putting your clothes on, and coming to class, by acting in the world, by being in the world. It has nothing to do with reaching a knowledge, an explanation of how things are, but coming to an understanding. And this understanding has to be really seen as a way of being in the world and of relating to beings, that is to entities, and to this underlying being itself, for which we're grounded. Another example, what is time? When I ask you what is time, to explain time, you can tell me, well, time, we talk about time with Bob today, and various ways of how you can talk about time. I'm just going to give you this is an analogy, right? I'm not trying to give you a physical, good physical explanation here of time, but you could say, time has something to do with, things passing, movement from now into a future moment, which makes the now the past, and some of that can be seen astronomically. You can say a day has something to do with the Earth's rotation and moving around the sun, and we get seasons and all that. That's beautiful. And then you can say even how we keep time. We have clocks and watches, and we build them in such a way that we can measure time. And that's beautiful. If you put it all together, maybe we have a way of explaining time. So now, at the end, I might have knowledge about how time works. I can explain what time is from that perspective. Okay? Again, it's an analogy. What it doesn't mean is that I would know what it means to be immortal and exist in time. That's a question that cannot be addressed this way. What it means to be immortal and exist in time is something that I negotiate by getting out of the bed in the morning, by thinking about, not thinking about, by just being a father to my son, knowing fully well that I will hopefully pray before him, die, leave him alone in the world, and that he eventually will go through terrible suffering, most likely, and will die too. Why am I doing this? There is an idea of meaning to that, but I could not tell you what that is. I negotiate that by being a loving father. But I don't negotiate that by necessarily, I try sometimes to sit down and ask myself what that meaning is, and then I don't go to sleep for 3 nights. But that's a different story. Right? So understanding has something to do with being in the world, with living your life in a certain way. What is time then? Understanding is a way of being in the world and a way of relating to beings and to being. How do I relate to my son, and how do I relate to this underlying being in which I'm grounded, and he too? What does Anna do with that? The first thing he does is he calls this ability to recognize this ontological difference and to reach beyond the objects of my sense experiences on the underlying horizon of being itself. He calls it the flow. This has been translated various ways in English. There's really not a great translation of this. One way to translate it is the pre-apprehension of being, which is, I think, good enough. Vorgriff in German is really for is before, right? Reaching out, and Griff is to grab something. So it's that you reach out beyond what you experience onto that underlying horizon of being itself and grab it. But you don't do this necessarily, as I said, not necessarily in a reflective fashion. You do it through doing that. So you experience yourself in the world, and by that you become for yourself the question of being. And the question of being that you are to yourself is not a question, once more, that you can formulate into a sentence. You come to yourself the question of being simply about being in the world, experiencing yourself in the world. And by experiencing yourself, you experience actually then this question. What is the meaning of my being? And you do this, of course, when you interact with other things. So in other words, anything you encounter could raise the question for you, why is there something about nothing? In the really most fundamental sense. And so what Anna says is this. In every categorical or historical experience, sense experience, there's also given this transcendental experience. And this transcendental experience is the experience of being itself. That which you reach through the flow. Okay? But then you have to ask, what is this underlying being? For Heidegger, that's an interesting question. Heidegger says it's nothingness, but not nothingness that is nothing. Okay, it's nothingness that is shrouded, and being is shrouded in nothingness. What is lying underneath there is a no-thingness rather than nothing. Right? It's more than that. It's what grounds things. So that's what he means by nothingness. What Anna says is, no, he wants to go with Thomas. He says, for Thomas, subsistent being, the totality of subsistent being, deals as if subsistence is God. So what Anna says is that this being which you can experience in that transcendental experience, practically through every sense experience that you have, you can reach it through that flow of that being is God. So in every categorical experience is also a transcendental experience, and that experience is a preconceptual experience of God. Why preconceptual? Again, because you don't. It's nothing that you think about necessarily in words, but you experience it. As awe, for example, as the awe that you might experience vis-a-vis the lumens. Okay. Well, now that's exactly what makes it interesting for me. Now, why does Anna think we have that? Well, this is, of course, for those of you who've studied Anna, you know this. That's this idea of the supernatural existential. It's that God in a quasi-formal causation. He sees us through grace, the supernatural existential. What does he mean by that? Quasi-formal is God acts like a formal cause, like a substantial form, without becoming part of that which it brings about. Right? So God acts as a quasi-formal cause. Okay. You can like that or not. That's how Anna works. I'm not a great fan of it. That's okay. Why is it existential? Thank you again, Martin Heidegger. The existential is what constitutes the human or the Dasein at its rock bottom. That's what constitutes us. The most fundamental thing constituting us for Anna is exactly the supernatural existential, nothing that we have from and by ourselves, but which we get through the grace of God. And it is what? It's the desiderium naturale, is that we are oriented towards God. Or to put this, again, in statistic terms, God creates out of love, to communicate God's self, and we receive the self-gift and respond with what? With the orientation towards God, with the desiderium naturale. Okay. Now, let's just summarize what we got so far. Self-conscious beings, or Dasein, I should say, certainly self-conscious beings, ask the Seinsfrage the meaning about the question about the meaning of being. They reach on to being as such by means of the photo. So in every categorical experience, there's also given a transcendental experience of that being itself.
Is this the CTNS event?
Yes. In each categorical experience, there's also given a revelatory transcendental experience. Why is it revelatory? Because, as I said, for Anna, this being which is experienced that way is God. Right? Subsistent being is God. So self-conscious beings, or God in that case, are events of the self-divine, of the self-communication. When he says events of the divine self-communication, we're not just recipients of the self-communication. Think about it, we are still quasi-formally caused supernatural existential. We have the supernatural existential, right? So by being a spiritual being, Dasein, we are in communication, in this personal communication and relationship with God. So we truly are events of it rather than only recipients of it. What does any of that have to do with animals? Fair question. Well, self-conscious beings with Dasein, always also transcendentally conscious. Now, of course, the Heideggerians here will say, wait a minute, you can't speak of self-consciousness and Dasein. right? Because Heidegger says it's not self-consciousness. Fair enough. I'll get to that. There's a reason why I put the emphasis here of self-consciousness, and that has to do with animals. Imagine we have non-human self-consciousness. We have non-human beings that are self-conscious. Yes, self-consciousness is not the same as Dasein, but a self-conscious being is also Dasein. So having self-consciousness would be indicative of a being being capable of having that transcendental experience of being a Dasein. But how can you show any of that self-consciousness and transcendental consciousness in non-human animals? I mean, it's really tricky. If I ask Braden, how are you today? And he said, I was great until this talk started. We know he is a self. Right? He can reflect upon himself, and all that works. Try that with an animal, and that doesn't work so well. Not even with this talk. So they will just not respond. Unless you find a way of how you can make them respond. So the question is how to show non-human self-consciousness. That's where the cognitive mythology comes. Just in terms to explain what I mean by that, cognitive mythology is a comparative study of evolutionary and theological aspects of the animals definition by Alan Becker. I think that works really well. It's a branch of behavioral biology that really thinks about the mental phenomena of animals. Okay, now what does cognitive mythology have to say? I would argue that if we manage to operationalize self-consciousness, the ecological toolkit would allow us to test for it. But how could you operationalize self-consciousness? How could you show that there's a self in there? Well, I would say this. Let's just think about this phenomenologically. The self is what? The self can be, I would argue, divided. It divides itself into an objective self and a subjective self. So when I think about myself, now conscious, self-conscious, reflecting upon myself, I'm both subject and object. I'm the object that I think about, and I'm the subject doing the thinking. Now the object internally self-symbolizes not the objective self. That would be crazy, because then I would think about Oliver, the other. If I do that, I need to seriously up my meds. But the objective self internally self-symbolizes the undivided self. To whom? To the subjective self who does the thinking. So, to self-reflect is, I would argue, an internal self-symbolization of the self. Does that make sense? It's phenomenologically, and it's rather simple. Bear with me. What happens if I externalize that? Could I externalize that? Well, think about it this way. If I look into the mirror and I see myself, what do I see? It's not that I see only the body. There are people who have that problem. They look into the mirror and they can't recognize the face. But that has to do with a neurological defect. Right? But when you, hopefully, I really hope, when you look into the mirror, what you see is not only yourself as your body. Okay, 5 o'clock doesn't count. Just the normal time you look in, you see yourself as the full self. So here the objective self, that on which I now literally reflect, is externalized into the mirror image, which then as external self-symbolization to the subjective self, the observer represents the undivided self. So if that holds, I tend to think it does. If you recognize yourself in the mirror, you are self-conscious. I would argue that you can only recognize yourself in the mirror if you're self-conscious. Because mirror self-recognition would be exactly that, external self-symbolization. How does that help us with animals? Well, again, if that holds, I've just operationalized self-consciousness, and now what we might be able to do is actually test it in animals. Can animals recognize themselves in the mirror? Now, Gordon Gallup did exactly that. Gordon Gallup is a comparative psychologist, and he studied chimpanzees in the 1970s. He put, trust me, behavioral biologists that did this kind of stuff, you sometimes just, it's not exactly throwing a Hail Mary, but you think of something really, really off the wall to to see when you can tease something out of your subjects, because they don't talk to you. And so he placed a mirror in front of chimpanzees to see how they would respond. And the first thing is that they were, it's like when you sometimes, I don't know if you've ever experienced that, you wake up at night, possibly in a hotel room or something, and you pass a mirror and you see yourself, and you get shocked because you see another person that you didn't expect. That's happened there too. That at first we're kind of like, what's that? And the first indication would be, the first response would sort of be social behavior, but very briefly. And then they would go, oh, look at that. That hand is moving. Huh. And then they did a very curious thing. And that makes total sense, because we would do that too, right? The first thing they did was, why would you do that? I mean, they don't do that in any other kind of social or any other kind of... No, they wanted to check what's in their mouth, because try it. It's really hard to get to. Even if you have a protruding nose like they do, you can't really see what's in there. The next thing they did was, sure, look around and go like, oh my God, I have a haircut. Right? So they checked out their body. Now he felt that's off behavior. And so what he did was, as a good scientist, he said, let's test if they really recognize themselves in the mirror. So what he did was he anesthetized the animals, and he marked them here on the ear and then on the other side of the eyebrow. And the dye they used was, as far as we know, wordless. The animals were knocked out so they didn't know that anything happened to them. Then he let them come to, let them recover. Everything was fine. Put them in front of a mirror. Now, what would you expect when you put an animal that is able to recognize its face in the mirror, that you just put some paint on? What would you expect them to do in the mirror? You would hope that there is some mark-oriented behavior, just like you would do if you wake up with, that silly movie that came out a while ago, where people go on I don't know, get drunk and then come back and there's a two in their face. You would put your mirror in, like, oh, that happened, right? So would that happen? Well, yes, that's exactly what happened. Here's the mark. This is behavior before the test. Mark-directed response before the test. So you test them before you even put anything on, and they touch their faces, sure. Here is what you see in the test after they got knocked out and they got the mark. And here's the control where you just do the same thing without the mark. So this has become the mark test. This is being used in human beings now. It's used as an indicator to show at what point do little children develop self-consciousness. You can try that out at home if you happen to have a 9-month-old or an 18-month-old around, depending on how much they were exposed to mirrors. Try it out, put them in front of a mirror, and see what happens. You can do that with a mark test. It's being done. Now, here's what it looks like. This is a female orangutan. This is, you saw she had a mark here on the forehead. This is shot through. You look through the mirror. It's a one-way mirror. And there's the mark range behavior. That might not convince you quite yet, but she's really trying to get it off. And now something interesting happens. She's not even looking into the mirror anymore. She just goes like this. Has to come off. Come on. That's a positive result of the mark test. So I would argue that this animal actually recognizes itself in the mirror. Now, if my first operationalization of self-consciousness holds, then this animal should be actually self-conscious. I would say it is. This has worked in elephants and corvid birds, like magpies, and there's reports of dolphins. So this is something that does not only happen in the hominid lineage. It seems to be something that happens in other lineages as well. Now, just to be sure what I'm saying, I would say that these animals are also conscious. They are capable of reflecting on themselves. So if that were the case, then the evolution of self-consciousness is something that has independently happened in different lineages of animals. It is starting from different lineages, from different perspectives, from different starting points. One is a dolphin, and one is a chimpanzee, and one is a bird. But it comes to the same behavior. Now, the important thing here is, just because it doesn't happen doesn't mean there is no self-consciousness. Okay, so absence of proof is never proof of absence. We have heard this many times. Just because an animal doesn't pass the mirror test, it doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't have self-consciousness. It just means that it may not have it, or it just might not be an optically oriented animal. There is now data from Mark Beckhoff that dogs might actually self-recognize their urine. Okay. Why? Dogs are, they go by smell, not by vision. So the mode of how animals communicate with each other, how they view the world, okay, how they orient themselves in the world, might play actually a really important role. So that's something to keep in mind here. There's another thing why people say, why some people would argue animals might have something as consciousness, and that is theory of mind. Theory of mind is supposed to be what? Well, this is from a work of Carmack and Woodruff, who talks about this on chimpanzees. They asked, do chimpanzees have a theory of mind? They define theory of mind like this. Saying that an individual has a theory of mind, we mean that the individual imputes mental states to himself and others. A system of inferences of this kind is properly viewed as a theory. First, because such states are not directly observable, and second, because the system can be made to make predictions specifically about the behavior of other organisms. Let's unpack that. When I stand here and I have a theory of mind of what is going on in you, then I have a theory of what it is that you might want, desire, need, what your mental states are. And how do I do that? By thinking, he thinks he might be, I don't know, hungry, he eats candy, or, somebody might be bored because they're yawning, or somebody might be thirsty because they're looking for water. So I have an idea, a theory of what is going on in you. Well, sure, that might very well be the case. But as Dan Sahabi asked very nicely, I think rightfully, is that really how we recognize, how we think about and experience people? Is it really plausible that the experience of self and of others are theoretical, inferential, and quasi-scientific in nature? I don't think so. I think when I encounter you, I don't have a theory of mind. That's why I think the theory of mind is often brought up as a way of saying, yeah, here is a being that has directionality, therefore self-conscious. I don't think that helps us much. I don't think that this is, you can do that, of course, but that's, when you encounter each other in a normal daily routine, you don't act theoretically on the other. You don't always think about what the other does. You will act actually very much in feeding yourself empathically into the other and acting accordingly to that. So the theory of mind isn't, I don't think, the important thing. The self-consciousness, yeah, that is important. And the examples of basic subjectivity, which have often been seen in the context of theory of mind, those, I think, are really important to consider. So if you take these chimpanzees here, what this adult is doing, she or he is cracking nuts. So you have to find a rock, big rock on which to place the nut, and then you have to crack it. But the problem is, chimpanzees have thumbs, and opposing thumbs, which allow them to grab things. They're not very strong. Simple, their tendons are shorter. So when a chimpanzee makes his arm long, the hand will automatically, because the tendons are short, go over. That's a great adaptation when you want to hang on a tree and not exert a lot of strength. It's a very bad adaptation if you ever happen to, as I heard one primatologist say, dissect a newly and freshly dyed, not a chimpanzee, but who's a gorilla, yeah. Dissect the gorilla when you're alone at night at the institute, because he grabbed him and he wanted to straighten him out on the table, and he pulled him, and the moment he pulled him, the hand grabbed him, right? So that can be a little scary. But it's a great adaptation. But it means that when you want to use nuts, you want to get to the fruit and the nuts, you need to have techniques, a certain technique to crack them. You have to practice that. It takes them a long time. The way they learn from each other is not by him saying, okay, son, you take the... No, of course not. They don't talk around language in the sense that we do. What they do is they allow the young animals to observe. They move very slowly. Instead of going, they go, okay. Get this? Right? And allow the kids to really climb on them, look. They're very patient about that. So it has been called the sushi chef approach. The sushi chef will not tell you what to do. You were supposed to learn by watching, right, by observing. So that's a clear sign of intersubjectivity, of feeling yourself into the other and knowing that the other somehow wants to learn, but not knowing necessarily what thinking about it in abstract terms. Other examples of intersubjectivity are reconciliation, when chimpanzees have fights with each other. After a while, the loser will go into a tree, will be shaken, and will sit there and wait. And, the winner occasionally comes up and says, okay, peace, friends again. Thereby taking the tension out of the fight, which of course helps the overall relationship in the community. But to do that, you have to somehow have a relationship. That intersubjectivity, subjective understanding more than knowledge of what is going on. Consolation is another one. If one member of the group gets beaten up by another, somebody else might just come, put its arm around, and console. Again, you can see that there is much more than just automatic behavior. These are not machines, biological machines. And then finally, there is warning. This is a group member in a place where chimpanzees are being prepared to be re-released in the wild. And here's a member of the family, of the group that died, and the others very quietly observe. There's a video that was recorded in the zoo not too long ago. The zoo are also in this station, where a female was dying, and group members would come and sit with her very quietly. Have you seen that? Yeah, just sit with her, touch her, very quietly. Nobody would just do the normal thing. They would just sit with her until she passed. Mothers are known to carry their babies for 3 months until they're mummified because they don't let go. Juveniles that lose parents are known to go really in depression. They will tear hair out, they will refuse food, and oftentimes they're being adopted by another member in the group. So a lot more there in terms of what you might call the subjectivity that perhaps might be taught. So what does that help us? Well, great apes and some other non-human animals test positive in the Mark test. Fine. There's evidence of intersubjectivity.
What's the Mark test?
That was the test where they recognize themselves in the mirror. So there's evidence for intersubjectivity in some non-human animals. Well, I would argue they're self-conscious. But also, therefore, they're Dasein. Now, that, again, the important thing here is it doesn't mean that you have to be acting self-consciously, right, to be a Dasein. But you have to have self-consciousness to be a Dasein. And once I can show that, I can infer the Dasein. So could it be that non-human animals are transcendentally oriented? I would say yes. And how would I argue that? Well, starting from where we started, could there be such a thing as a photo in non-human animals? Well, if indeed they're self-conscious, if indeed there are Dasein, then yes, they experience themselves, and they become to themselves design stars, the question of the meaning of being. Again, remember, this is a preconceptual question, so they don't ask the question. They become it themselves. And of course, with everything they encounter in the world, that too raises design spot. And if that's the case, then yes, for them too, in every categorical experience, there's also transcendental experience. Photograph, onto what does the photograph go there? Well, onto the same totality of subsistent being, which is God. And if that's the case, then their transcendental experience is also an unplanetized experience of God. So, put that all together, and I would say, yes, self-conscious, non-human animals lack language. That's fine. They have no religion. There's no narrative. There's no scripture. Get that? But I would call it proto-religiosity, or proto-religion. Why? Because it's transcendentally conditioned. They are transcendentally conditioned and have an unplanetized knowledge of God, on which religion, even in us, can be based. And I would say that they are in a species-specific personal relationship with God. Now, I owe you one more thing, and then I'm done. I promise. This is getting long, but are we? I'll shoot through this very quickly. How do we get there? How does that work evolutionarily? Remember, there was a whole idea of evolution has to be embraced here. Well, I would call it a theology of becoming. And here again, I turn to Carvana. I'd say that he sees evolution as active self-transcendence. The starting place is a dual aspect monism, meaning that matter and spirit are always a difference in unity. You can't have one without the other. Why? Because matter and spirit have their origin in God and are not disparate realities. Doesn't mean that elementary particles are self-conscious. No, it means that they have a spiritual aspect to it, and that in an evolutionary process, they can become more complex and eventually come to a degree where consciousness can truly emerge. And then he argues from a normal, more or less normal Aristotelian Thomistic theory of potentiality and actualization. And he uses here thinking from 17th century Jesuits. So you have the idea of a being, and in that being is in some way contained a potential new being. How is that new being brought forth? Well, through efficient causation. External or internal efficient causation. Biology, natural selection, all of that sort. Expression of genes. That's all efficient causation. And so the new being is actualized. Well, that's great, but how far is God involved here? Well, you go from less to more. Not in the sense of that we are more valuable, but in the sense that the idea here would be self-conscious beings are more actualized being than less or non-self-conscious beings. Right? More self-present. How can that happen? Only through the divine concurrence, that is God acting as the transcendental condition of the possibility of that becoming, right? Of that increase in being. Think of the divine concurrence in such a way that you have God on the transcendent end of the side of a river, you have the efficient causes on the creature or the side of the river, and both have a rope tied to a boat and pull it in the same direction, as an analogy. Right? So both pull bring about the new actualized state in unison. So God is really the transcendental condition of the possibility of becoming. And from that aspect, now we're really talking about cosmic evolution. From the very earliest moment of the Big Bang, this active self-transcendence of spirit matter moving towards self-consciousness is at work. And it is at work in multiple ways, not only on our planet probably, and certainly not only in our species. Biological diversity, I would argue, always leads also to spiritual diversity. All right, and with that, I already put you through the ringer, I apologize, but now we can discuss if you still want. Thank you. Questions? Thoughts?
I would have thought that you might want to put a gradation of humans, apes, monkeys, each one with less of this quality. Bacteria.
Yeah, so the first thing I want to say is there is, of course, if you adopt this type of thinking, there are a number of things to say. First up, This is a form of essentialism. And essentialism embedded into evolutionary biology, which a lot of evolutionary biologists find rather peculiar. Theologians probably too. But the other thing is, there is of course at work the scala natura, or the idea of the scala natura, with one major difference. It's no longer a pyramid or a staircase that leads to one pinnacle of us. Rather, it's something that can be mapped onto the evolutionary tree. So is there a hierarchy? Not in the sense of value, of course, but is there a hierarchy in the sense of that certain beings are more actualized beings as they are more self-present? Yes. But it's no longer the scala natura in the strictest sense, right? Because you get the diversification. But other than that, I would have theoretically no problem with it when rightfully understood. I'm not saying that animals that are not self-conscious or not Dasein, but they are of lesser value.
Related to this, first of all, thank you. But related to this, I go back to your example of the mark test with the mirror. You say that with the chimpanzee was possible to do that, and also with some other two animals you listed, but with other it's impossible because we don't know how they get to self-conscious.
Or they don't have it.
Or they don't have it. Active, because then you said that this presence of spirit, you see it through the whole cosmos. It's not only, the difference is in the grades of activation.
No, I mean, what you have through the cosmos is that active self-transcendence, that movement towards the self.
Yes, but since matter and spirit are not divided, but they are united, and the spirit is activated more in some degrees than others, okay? Now, my question is this, going back now to the question that you don't want the pinnacle,
right,
but more dispersed. Your way of testing the self-consciousness in a certain way and not another is still anthropocentric. You cannot get out of anthropocentric perspective. That means that self-consciousness most realized can be in another species, not human.
Absolutely. I'm not saying that we are it. No, you're absolutely correct. I would actually even go so far as to, if there is a species that is more actualized being than we are, we would not recognize it because we wouldn't know how.
Right.
So that's very possible. I'm using the mirror self-recognition starting from my place, and it's an argument from analogy, and I know all about the problems of arguments from analogy, but it's the best that we got. But I'm starting there simply why? Because it proves the possibility. If this can hold, then the case that you described could very well be a reality. You see what I mean? I think this shows, I would argue this shows that these animals that have this particular way of self-recognition, there should also be the awe that Gödel was talking about. I think it's the awe of the ineffable, of which Heschel and Otto were talking about. I think it's one and the same thing. It works because I'm starting from, of course, being from operationalizing self-consciousness in a way that I would start phenomenologically from how I experience myself or reflect upon myself. That's all fair and square. But if that holds, again, one could say the analogical is problematic, but it's the only one we got really. But if that holds, then what you bring up is very possible. Absolutely. And again, I would argue we would not recognize it.
So how much of what you're saying is dependent upon Ordwith and Heidegger? I think you can remove those things and still make the argument that you're making. Am I wrong?
Let me put it this way. If you remove the idea of Heidegger, and I know people don't, it's complicated, it's European, and let's face it, Marty was an old Nazi. We know. No. I have my problems with it too, but nevertheless, philosophy, I think it was one of the most brilliant insights of the 20th century, certainly, and pretty much correct I would say most of modern philosophy is in some sense responding to this, even when they say, I don't like it. And I sometimes feel like German philosopher, help me out, you know, Jürgen, no, contemporary. And Habermas, you know, Habermas started with Heidegger, and was, you know, of course, he loved what Heidegger had to say about being, and then he became very upset because the whole Nazi thing came out, and that he didn't want to have anything to do with him, which is really tragic. I feel the same way. You don't like the guy really, but you know his ideas are great. But anyway, that's not the answer to the question. That was just a little meandering. Let me come back to your question. Could I take this away and still reach the same thing? I'm not entirely sure. The thing is this, the awe that we experience, and how far is the experience really revelatory of God? How can you do that? How can you argue for that? It could just be awe. It could just be, you know, I could just say, yeah, of course it's awe. You need to have awe, because otherwise you die out. You will die in evolution. You have to have certain things where you go like, oh, look at this. This is amazing. Because it helps you to negotiate your way around the world and not get eaten and organize things that might help you through. It could be very adaptive to have awe, and it might be reduced to that. But if you phenomenologically analyze what that might be, that you experience there, how you become to yourself a question, and a question of what. It opens up, I think, this whole realm of being itself. And one way of then relating that to God is to bring it into conversation with, you know, traditional Christian or Judeo-Christian theology. If you leave that out, I'm not entirely sure how you would make that connection.
Well, there's all these kind of leaps. You look through one of these rants that this gentleman over here was talking about. You're talking about consciousness and different kinds, going all the way up to human consciousness, and you leave open the question: is this imago Dei or whatever? Is that consciousness, or is that an additional capability of the mind that is lacking in consciousness?
See, this is the problem. I mean, the tradition is dearly divided on this. And there are those who will say, yes, it is consciousness. You have to have language, you know, and all these kind of things, you know, about ideas of that and interpretations. All I'm saying is that's exactly the problem with the imago Dei. It's just, I don't know what it is. And I don't know how to go about it. I mean, I tried it, and I said, yeah, that is, so extend category. But then, you know, fairly, I mean, absolutely, you know how I asked Josh the question, well, how did God recognize who to bestow the gift on? He immediately asked me, well, how do you reconcile this with Scripture? And I would say, okay, your point, I don't know. So you really have to you know, so that's exactly the reason why I want to leave that category out.
The other side of the coin is, why not Buddhism? Why not sentience? Why not...
Because I'm a Christian.
But you should know this Buddhist guy praying all the time like that.
No. I'm very. Let me say this. If I were an anonymous Buddhist, I would have to perhaps now say that if animals are conscious, are Dasein, let me put it this way, because mind you, Heidegger in his late years moved very much towards Eastern philosophy for nothingness. He didn't know, you know. Remember how then in his later work he writes Dasein, you know, crosses it out, and then he goes to he goes from here to here, and you know, going, okay, Martin, what do you know about this? You know, but anyway, Sein, I should say. I said Dasein, but Sein, he crosses out Dasein. Sein. But the point is this: if this argument holds what I would say from a Buddhist perspective is that the Four Noble Truths apply to those animals as well. What I cannot say anymore is whether the Eightfold Path to overcome suffering holds. I don't know whether they can actually act accordingly. Buddhism is, for all intents and purposes, as much as I like it and so forth, that's really a very anthropocentric perspective. Why? Because it's the overcoming of suffering as a psychological condition that will ultimately lead to an ontological overcoming of reality, of physical reality, enlightenment.
Only humans are capable of.
And which only humans are capable of.
The Vedas can say.
Yeah, exactly, which only humans are capable of. So would the four Noble Truths hold? Yes. Would the Eightfold Path hold? I don't know. I've never, you could argue that sitting in front of the river, watching at the water might be a form of meditation. But I don't think that that's what Buddhist meditation would look like. But again, the reason why I don't look to Buddhism is simply because I'm a Christian.
An operational definition of imago Dei, why does it have to be a discrete entity? In other words, if it's a question of degree and the ability to reflect on the nature of God is a higher definition of imago Dei than an entity that is not able to do that. That everything is created in imago Dei, but it's a continuum. And the distinct ability of Homo sapiens compared to gorillas is that we can think about the nature of God. A gorilla doesn't, as far as we can detect, think about the nature of God, or many others. So it's on that continuum. And so the concept of imago Dei does have meaning.
So actually what you're describing here is very much something that Langdon Gilkey suggested in 1994 and which Greg Peterson picks up. And the idea here is all of nature images God. That doesn't mean that some part of nature images it in such a way that we have ways of relating to God in a different way. That's all fair and square. All I'm saying is you don't get that from the text. I like that. It's beautiful. You don't get it from the text.
Well, I think it is a reformed view of the nature of the text, just as we do with many aspects of the text.
And I'm fine with that. I don't, two reasons here why I didn't continue on the image. I recognize that there's too little in the text to really reform it that much. So for me, the border between eisegesis and exegesis becomes rather slim. I got too many over the knuckles from exegesis. So, The other thing is, I don't need that as a category to think about a personal relationship with God, because for me, the personal relationship with God starts with the transcendental experience. Now, if you call that already the imago Dei or something else, or the B'Tselem Elohim, I really leave up to the exegetes.
Well, the importance, I think, of the term imago Dei is that it says the importance of following ever more deeply the imago Dei. In other words, the thought about God and reflecting on the nature of God, the experience of God.
But where does it say that?
Well, what I'm saying is, you were saying earlier that it's not important really that we stay with this term imago Dei. But what I'm saying is it's fundamentally important, because what it says is, in order to probe into the infinite depth of the nature of God, you need to have the concept of the imago Dei and what that realization is.
I understand you say what you're saying, but my question is, you said because it says, and I'm asking where does it say that? It's not in the text. This is something that the tradition has developed, and I don't think it's necessary to jettison it, therefore. All I'm saying is I'm not trying to jettison it entirely. Maybe I spoke too harshly here.
Right.
What I'm trying is to ignore it for the question at hand, which is really the nature of the personal experience or the personal relationship. And for that, that's where I need Heidegger, that's where I need Hannah. It's about the transcendental experience. Now, at what point that qualifies as imago Dei or not, which is a substantive interpretation that would, for the most part, with exegetes, sit not so well, as far as I understand. Most exegetes would say that substantive interpretation is really the least likely one. And the next right next to it would be the relational. So most exegetes would probably turn towards the functional. But, you know, I'm not an exegete, so I dare not say too much for what maybe you're a Bible scholar.
No, I just started reading a lot. I don't know if you've come across Richard Elton's book, Liberating Image, and I think actually it's more towards relational. By trying to situate the term in the ancient Near Eastern context, and saying it's kind of a democratized version of the king as the image of God in some ways. It's representational, represent God in creation.
Right. That's another form, which is not, I wouldn't call that relational, but that's I would call it another form of functional. It's just that you function as like the statue functions, which goes back to von Rath and so forth. But yeah, so my problem is not with your point of view. My problem is simply that your point of view has nothing to do, or has something to do, but not much, with the text. That like all interpretations of the Imago Dei, what you're talking about is a substantive interpretation which has its origins really in Philo of Alexandria, who made the move to bring in Aristotle and Hellenistic categories to think about what the human being is and bring that into parallel with the image of God. I find that, you know, I tried that. You know, that was my first attempt at this, was exactly that route. But I don't think it's necessarily the best approach. That's why I'm saying, you know, if people think, I find the image of God, the Tzelem Elohim, I find it a very loose category to build either, certainly not a theology of animals, but also a theological anthropology on it. It's very...
I'll just make one final point. I think that the genius of the text is that there's so many of these terms like atonement, which come out of the text at a certain point in the development of human cognition and history. And now, with deeper knowledge, we're able to see the genius of those words interpreted through what we now know, which they couldn't possibly have known when the text was created. So the genius of the words is that there's so many of these concepts that are there and still have meaning.
Help me out here. When you say atonement in the text, which text are you talking about?
Well, when I'm talking about a concept of atonement, I mean, this gets off I don't want to take it.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
I mean, the concept of atonement that works with evolutionary theology is the concept of a God who creates through an evolutionary process and then comes into history and into the creation to be with the creation, be at one with the creation in its suffering, and to show that creation the way through that suffering into a greater truth. So that more historical concepts of the atonement, justification theory, and sanctification, all of that gets looked at in a different way. And we look at it in a different way because we have the results now of science that tell us the way in which God creates in this universe.
I don't have fundamentally an issue with that, although first thing is atonement is really something we get from Anselm. We don't get it from the text.
Right.
So it's not in the text. Atonement is a theory, a medieval theory, to basically tell us why Christ died for our sins, why God became human. And atonement has something to do with God wanting us to atone, but thinking us not worthy enough, so therefore God incarnates.
Right.
And if you reevaluate that from evolutionary biology, you don't get much further than that. I don't quite see how you can do it because it has fundamentally to do with the concept of God, with the doctrine of God. That's why I like to turn to Scotus here. If you stick with that concept of God, you can I think, turn around the term atonement as much as you want. You will always have to deal with the question of why does God want us to atone? Because of our original sin, and for that we have to atone. And that's problematic, I think. But I don't think it has anything, I don't think evolutionary biology would help us any further.
In relation to the continuum theory, or continuum model for Imago Dei, where would you see liminal humans, like anencephalic infants who never passed the mark test?
Oh.
Or many other humans?
First person who asked me this question was that person over there. Many years ago. And I always keep saying, oh, God, those ethicists, there's only one There's one thing that an ethicist will invariably tell you when you have a problem and ask them. Invariably, every ethicist will give you the same answer. No matter what their background, they will always say it depends. What good they're ethicists. No, I'm kidding. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the Imago Dei gives us one thing that is fairly important. It gives us the concept of intrinsic value. Why is even an encephalic child, why has it intrinsic value? Well, because it is in the image of God. That's not my problem here. My problem is about the personal relationship. I'm not saying that your value increases with personal relationship. That's a problem for you guys to figure out. And the intrinsic value of being, I would say that all nature has intrinsic value. That God creates out of love in order to communicate God's self. All of creation is there to receive God's unknown, loving self-gift. That to me tells me that all nature has intrinsic value. Now, I agree that the image of God helps with that. Not the me, not the image of God, actually, but helps me with the intrinsic value of all nature. All things is actually generation. No talk of the image, no talk of intrinsic of dominion, but Adam is created, where is he put into the garden to do what with it? To tend it. And what happens next? Adam is given what? Companionship. Who's the companion? The animals. Right? Why would God think of animals as companions? Because all of nature has intrinsic value. Now, how do I argue for the intrinsic value of a child that has no personal relationship with God? Well, I don't have to, because I think every being has intrinsic value. How am I arguing for how to deal with them ethically? I can't. I'm not an ethicist, but I can tell you one thing, because it's the invariable answer that I always get. It depends.
I'm sorry I cut the conversation short, but we need to move on. I want to thank you all for coming. I hope you can come back in April. We have our annual J.K. Russell Fellowship. There's a public talk at a research conference.
Where are we going to talk going to be?
This year it's Noreen Hertzfeld.
Where are you going to be?
It's probably going to be in the GT library. We don't have a place scheduled yet, but there'll be more information coming out in the next couple months. So please, one more time, thank you to